Hello my friends, welcome to another video in this 20-day flower creation journey. My name is Luisa and this is the Lulu Blue Studio. Today is day 13 and together we can paint these beautiful dahlias, round in shape, with long petals towards the external part, shorter petal in the center, and long green leaves. So to start to create these dahlias, I take my filbert brush. This is in size 10 and I grab a little bit of Scarlet Lake and a little bit of magenta and I mix on my color palette this red. I start from the center of this dahlia and I start to touch the paper with the side of my filbert brush, and leaving the white center, I create all around these short petals that are a characteristic of the dahlias, and I work in a circle way, in a circle motion. Therefore I create these short brush strokes all around. I keep in mind to remove part of the pigment in my cup of water, and in this way I will change the color value that I have on the brush, and therefore I will obtain different values of this red, and I keep touching the paper to create these petals. I add a little bit of pure magenta into the petals that I have just created, and in this way some of the magenta color will blend with the red that I have underneath, and we will create some beautiful wet in wet effects. I suggest you to do the same with your painting. I suggest you in fact to create these short brush strokes with, for example, a filbert brush if you have it, and remember to change the color in itself, which is called hue, in order to create a flower that is more dynamic to look at. This is a loose style representation of a dahlia, therefore you can create as many petals as you'd like. I am adding a little bit of concentrated Scarlet Lake in the center, and since the center is still quite wet, I will allow it to blend with the first layer of pigment that I have laid onto paper. When I start to create the second dahlia, I use the same approach. I start from the center of the dahlia, I leave a white space that I will fill in a second moment, and with the side of my brush I create these loose petals just by touching the paper. In fact, the filbert brush has a flat side, and this helps perfectly in this case to create these petals for these dahlias. The more I create the outer petals, the lighter the color value is. I like to have usually the center of the flowers I create in a more concentrated color, and the outer I create these petals, I use a lighter value. I blend a little bit of magenta and a little bit of red, and I give these petals some dimension through the wet in wet technique. In the lower corner, in the left side, I start to create another dahlia. I start from the center and I create the center with very short brush strokes and very concentrated in color. I keep removing part of the pigment in my cup of water, and I keep adding additional petals that are much lighter in color value. I try to remind myself that all of the petals need to lead towards the same center, and this will give to these flowers, although they are in a very loose style, a more realistic look. I am adding a few brush strokes of more concentrated magenta, and I let this color, the pure magenta, to blend with the first layer of a mixture of magenta and Scarlet Lake. I keep refining the shape of the first dahlia that I've created, where the painting is still a little bit wet, and I add some brush strokes of red Scarlet Lake through the wet in wet technique. At this point, we have created the main flowers, so we can proceed to create the stems and the leaves. And with this in mind, I used this new brush so I can test it out. This is a quill brush from Princeton. I will leave the link in the description below. And I decided to use this one to create the stems because the point is very fine. This brush has a very fine tip, which I think is very interesting to create the stems. But the belly of this quill brush is instead quite thick and it holds a lot of water. So I want to try to use it to create some leaves. If you don't have a quill brush or a mop brush at your disposal, feel free to keep using, for example, a round brush to create these leaves. Leaves are created by touching the paper with the tip of this brush and then dragging the paint onto the paper through the belly and then releasing the pressure until the tip of the brush touches the paper. It's a very gentle movement where I touch the paper, I keep moving the belly and the tip of the brush towards the upper part of the paper, and then I release the pressure and I create this round shape leaf. I use a mixture of yellow lemon dip and a little bit of yellow ochre with sap green to create this leaf. And I add a little bit of yellow ochre and concentrated yellow lemon dip to add, through the wet in wet technique, some additional brush strokes. So I touch the paper with the tip of this brush and I drag the paint and I create this long leaf with a tip that is pointy and is very fine. And I keep adding these leaves wherever I see that there is some white space onto paper and where I feel there is the need to cover some of this empty space with some greens. When the first layer of green is still wet, I like to add a little bit of more concentrated and darker pigment. In this way, I add a layer of darker green, which is a mixture of magenta and sap green with a touch of blue, of phthalo turquoise. You can decide to use any sort of darker green. I recommend something with a touch of red because the red is the color that we use for the peonies, and therefore using a little bit of red into the sap green will mute a little bit the sap green, the brightness of the sap green, and will close the gap between the red and the green, these two different colors that we're using. I mix a little bit of phthalo turquoise and a little bit of Prussian blue with a little bit of sap green, and with this dark green I touch the leaves where they are still wet and I allow this darker green to blend together with this wet first layer of the leaves that I've created. When I'm satisfied with this process, I arrived at the point where I can start to add the yellow center of these dahlias. I just take a fine brush, for example this is a round brush in size 6, and I just take a little bit of yellow lemon dip and I cover the empty space that I left in first place. I take back the quill brush, and since this has a very fine tip, I like to use it to try to create these additional strokes that will define better the inner and outer petals of these dahlias. So just using the very fine tip of this quill brush, I created some very fine lines, mainly using a little bit of magenta or a little bit of scarlet lake. And with this technique, I'm just trying to define better these petals, because if you look at the reference picture, these dahlias have a lot of petals. Therefore, I'd like to enhance the shape of these dahlias and the shape of these petals throughout all of the flowers. I encourage you to do the same, but if you don't like to add these final strokes, and you are happy with the, for example, wet in wet that you were able to achieve applying the first layer of these dahlias, feel free to stop at this moment and enjoy what you have painted. If you don't have a quill brush, you can use a simple round brush and the fine tip of a round brush to create a similar effect. And at this point, we have reached the end of day 13 of this dahlia tutorial. I hope to see you tomorrow on day 14.